On the morning of August 14th, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the small window of the military transport train, watching the American landscape roll past with the careful attention of a naval officer who had spent years studying enemy intelligence photographs. The 32-year-old submarine commander had memorized charts of the Pacific coastline, tactical maps of Pearl Harbor, and reconnaissance images of San Francisco Bay. Nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what lay ahead on the western horizon. Yamamoto believed, as did the 173 other Japanese prisoners traveling with him, that America was a nation of soft industrialists whose cities rose from flat coastal plains, whose people had never known the spiritual discipline forged by living beneath the shadow of sacred mountains. They would soon discover just how profoundly wrong that assumption was. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these men would witness in the coming days would shatter not just their understanding of American geography, but their entire conception of the nation they had been fighting. A transformation so complete that many would spend the rest of their lives trying to reconcile what they had believed with what they had seen. The train had departed from a processing facility in San Francisco 3 days earlier, carrying prisoners who represented a cross-section of the Imperial Japanese military forces. Among them was Commander Yamamoto, captured when his submarine suffered catastrophic damage during an engagement off the Aleutian Islands. There was Lieutenant Kenji Nakamura, a 28-year-old fighter pilot shot down over the Solomon Islands after completing 47 combat missions. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, a 35-year-old infantry veteran of the China campaigns, sat in quiet meditation despite the swaying of the train car. Petty Officer Yuki Sato, barely 21 years old, kept a secret diary hidden in his uniform, documenting everything with the precision he had once applied to maintaining aircraft engines. The journey itself had already challenged their expectations. The trains were not cattle cars, but proper passenger carriages, albeit with barred windows and armed guards. They received 3 meals daily, not luxurious but substantial and regular. The American guards, mostly young men from Midwestern farming communities, treated them with professional correctness rather than the brutality Japanese military doctrine had taught them to expect from enemy captors. Corporal James Mitchell from Iowa, a 24-year-old farm boy assigned to guard duty after a training injury made him ineligible for combat deployment, found himself fascinated by the prisoners. He had grown up hearing about Japanese treachery and fanaticism, yet the men in his charge seemed remarkably ordinary, tired, anxious, and clearly uncertain about their fate. One spoke passable English, having worked in Honolulu before the conflict, and occasionally translated questions from other prisoners about their destination. Through the night, the train climbed steadily. The prisoners, exhausted from weeks of uncertainty following their capture, mostly slept fitfully, but Yamamoto remained alert, noting the gradual change in the air pressure, the way his ears popped slightly. The subtle shift in the train's engine sounds as it worked harder, against an increasing grade. When dawn broke on August 15th, Petty Officer Sato was the first to notice the change. He had positioned himself near the western-facing window as the train rounded a gradual curve, and suddenly he gripped the window bars with both hands, his usual careful composure vanishing. "Yama," he whispered, using the ancient word for mountain, his voice barely audible. Lieutenant Nakamura moved to the window beside him and froze. Within seconds, every prisoner in the car had crowded toward the western windows, and a profound silence fell over men who had maintained disciplined quiet throughout their captivity. The Rocky Mountains rose before them like a wall of stone and snow that seemed to touch the sky itself. Pikes Peak, standing at 14,115 feet above sea level, dominated the western horizon, its snow-covered summit catching the early morning light and turning golden pink against the deep blue of the high-altitude sky. To the north and south, the continental divide stretched as far as the eye could see, an unbroken chain of peaks that made the Japanese Alps, which many of these men had known since childhood, seem like foothills by comparison. Commander Yamamoto, who prided himself on maintaining absolute discipline, felt his carefully constructed understanding of America, cracking like ice under spring sun. He had studied American industrial capacity, knew the statistics of steel production and aircraft manufacturing, had memorized the numbers. 50,000 aircraft produced in 1943 alone, a figure that exceeded total Japanese production since the conflict began. But numbers on intelligence reports were abstract. This was tangible, immediate, undeniable. "It's not possible," Sergeant Tanaka murmured, his voice carrying the confusion of a man whose worldview was being dismantled. "Our briefing said America was all cities and farmland, coastal plains. Where did these mountains come from?" "They were always here," Commander Yamamoto said quietly, still staring at the peaks. "We simply chose not to know about them." The train continued westward, and as it did, the scale of what they were seeing became even more apparent. These were not isolated peaks, but an entire mountain system, hundreds of miles long, wide enough that the train traveled for hours, while the mountains grew steadily larger and more imposing. Small towns appeared in valleys that would have dwarfed anything in Japan, vast stretches of agricultural land at elevations where such farming should have been impossible, fed by snowmelt from peaks that never fully lost their white caps, even in summer. Corporal Mitchell watched the prisoners' reactions with growing interest. He had expected fear or hostility, but what he saw was something closer to shock, even awe. Several of the prisoners were writing frantically in small notebooks. Others simply stared, occasionally speaking in rapid Japanese that sounded more like questions than statements. The transport train arrived at Camp Granada, located in the high desert of southeastern Colorado, in the early afternoon. The facility had been constructed specifically to house prisoners from the Pacific Theater, positioned deliberately to provide maximum security through sheer geographic isolation. The nearest city of any size was over 100 miles away. But security was only part of the reasoning behind the camp's location. Captain Martin Whitmore, the camp's commanding officer, was a student of psychology before the conflict had called him to military service. He had spent 2 years in Japan in the 1930s, teaching English at a university in Kyoto, and he understood something that many of his fellow officers did not. The Japanese military's strength came not primarily from equipment or numbers, but from an unshakable conviction in their cultural and spiritual superiority. "Let them see the mountains," Whitmore had argued to his superiors when the camp's location was being debated. "Let them understand the scale of what they're facing, not with propaganda or lectures, but with simple geographic reality." As the prisoners were processed into the camp, a procedure conducted with bureaucratic efficiency, but also unexpected courtesy, Whitmore made a point of speaking to groups of them through interpreters. "You will be treated according to the international agreements governing prisoners," he said, his Japanese accent rusty but comprehensible to those who had studied English before the conflict. "You will work, as is permitted under these agreements, but you will be paid in camp scrip. You will receive medical care equivalent to that provided to American soldiers. You are prisoners, yes, but you are also human beings, and you will be treated as such." Lieutenant Nakamura, standing in the formation of newly arrived prisoners, found himself profoundly confused. This speech contradicted everything he had been taught about American attitudes toward Asian peoples. The camp itself, while clearly a prison, was constructed with surprising thoughtfulness. The barracks were wooden structures with proper roofing, windows with glass and stoves for heating. The latrines were clean and well maintained. The mess hall, visible across the compound, was a substantial building that suggested meals would be regular and adequate. More than the physical facilities, it was the behavior of the American guards that unsettled the Japanese prisoners. The guards maintained discipline, but without the casual brutality that characterized military life in the imperial forces. They did not strike prisoners for small infractions. They did not engage in the ritual humiliations that Japanese prisoners would have expected to inflict on defeated enemies. Petty Officer Sato, still keeping his secret diary, wrote that night, "We expected to be treated as we would treat American prisoners, with the contempt deserved by those who surrendered rather than dying honorably. Instead, they treat us almost with indifference, as though our presence is merely an administrative matter, rather than a moral failing. I do not understand these people. The first weeks at Camp Granada established routines that would continue throughout the prisoners' stay. Work details were organized. Some prisoners worked in the camp's gardens, growing vegetables to supplement their rations. Others worked in workshops, manufacturing furniture and goods for the camp itself. Those with technical skills were assigned to maintenance tasks. The work was real but not punishing, and the Americans enforced regular breaks and reasonable hours with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to everything else. But it was the weekend recreational activities that truly began to reshape the prisoners' understanding of their captors. On Sundays, weather permitting, groups of prisoners were taken on supervised hikes into the foothills of the Rockies. Commander Yamamoto was part of the first group selected for these hikes. Their American escort was Lieutenant David Chen, a Chinese-American officer from California, whose grandparents had immigrated to San Francisco in the 1880s. Chen spoke some Japanese, learned during his intelligence training, and he walked alongside Yamamoto, occasionally pointing out features of interest. "That peak to the northwest is over 13,000 feet, Chen said, gesturing toward a snow-covered summit. "There are 58 peaks in Colorado alone that exceed 14,000 feet. We call them the 14ers. People climb them for recreation." "For recreation?" Yamamoto repeated, uncertain he had understood correctly. "Yes. In peacetime, thousands of civilians climb these mountains every year. Families, students, elderly people. There are trails, guidebooks, clubs dedicated to climbing all 58 peaks." Yamamoto stopped walking. "You are telling me that American civilians, in their leisure time, choose to climb mountains higher than anything in Japan, simply for the enjoyment of it?" "That's correct. And yes, 58 peaks over 14,000 feet, hundreds more over 13,000. The Rocky Mountain Range extends from here north into Canada, over 3,000 miles of mountains." Yamamoto stood silent for a long moment, looking at the peaks surrounding them. Finally, he said, "We were told America was a soft nation, that your people loved only comfort and luxury, that you would collapse when faced with true hardship." Chen considered his response carefully. "America is many things. We do love comfort, that's true, but we also have people who choose to live in places like this, who ranch at 8,000 feet elevation, who build towns in valleys surrounded by peaks that would terrify most people. We're complicated, Commander, just like Japan is complicated." That evening, Yamamoto wrote a letter to his wife, his first since capture. The censors would read it, he knew, but he felt compelled to share what he had seen. "I have observed mountains today that dwarf our sacred Fuji," he wrote. "I am beginning to understand that our intelligence services may have provided us with data about America's industrial capacity, without helping us understand what such capacity actually means." As summer turned to autumn, the prisoners' daily life at Camp Granada took on unexpected dimensions. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Samuel Goldstein, was a Jewish physician from New York who had served in rural areas before the conflict. He treated prisoner ailments with the same thoroughness he had once applied to his civilian practice. "Why do you care whether I live or die?" Tanaka asked through an interpreter during one visit when he had developed a respiratory infection. "I am your enemy." Dr. Goldstein considered the question seriously. "Right now, Sergeant, you're a sick man in my infirmary. That makes you my patient, not my enemy. When you recover, you'll go back to being a prisoner and I'll go back to being a camp doctor. But in this room, at this moment, you're simply someone who needs medical care." This attitude, the ability of Americans to compartmentalize roles without apparent cognitive dissonance, was perhaps the most alien aspect of captivity for the Japanese prisoners. Americans seemed to move fluidly between roles, stern disciplinarian one moment, casual conversationalist the next, efficient administrator in the morning, friendly rival in an evening baseball game. The camp organized sports competitions between prisoners and guards. Lieutenant Nakamura, who had played baseball in university, found himself pitching against a team of American guards on a diamond constructed by prisoner labor. The Americans won 12-7, but what stayed with Nakamura was not the score, but the handshakes afterward, the casual praise for a well-thrown pitch, the complete absence of gloating or humiliation. As autumn deepened, The mountains took on new character. The aspen trees turned golden yellow, creating vast swaths of color against the dark green of pine forests and the gray of granite peaks. The first snows came early to the high peaks, and the prisoners watched in fascination as storms swept across summits 20 miles away, while the camp remained in sunshine. Petty Officer Sato wrote extensively about the changing seasons. The Americans speak of these mountains with a casualness that suggests they do not fully appreciate their grandeur, he noted. Yet they live among them without apparent effort. Their trucks drive roads that switch back and forth up mountainsides, where we would consider passage impossible. But it was a visit to the camp by civilian educators that perhaps most profoundly impacted the prisoners' understanding of America. In November of 1944, Captain Whitmore arranged for a delegation from the University of Colorado to visit the camp and conduct English language classes for interested prisoners. The delegation included Professor Margaret Harrison, a 62-year-old linguist who had spent time in China and Japan before the conflict. Professor Harrison was a short, energetic woman who reminded several of the prisoners of their grandmothers. She taught with infectious enthusiasm, engaging the prisoners in discussions about literature, philosophy, and culture with genuine interest in their perspectives. During one session, Commander Yamamoto asked her, "Professor, how can you teach us the enemies of your nation with such kindness?" Professor Harrison smiled. "Commander, I've spent my life studying languages and cultures. I've learned that the best antidote to hatred is understanding, and the best antidote to conflict is conversation. You are prisoners today, but someday this terrible conflict will end, and you will return to Japan. When you do, you'll carry memories of your time here. I would rather you carry memories of Americans who treated you as human beings worthy of respect." She paused, then added, "Besides, education is never wasted. Whatever you learn here, you will carry with you. Knowledge is the one thing that can never be taken from you." That winter was harsh even by Colorado standards. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero on several occasions. The prisoners, provided with proper winter clothing and heated barracks, fared better than they would have in many Japanese military facilities. The American guards, many from northern states, seemed almost indifferent to temperatures that the Japanese prisoners found challenging. They worked outside in conditions that should have been debilitating, performing maintenance and security duties with the same casual efficiency they displayed in warmer weather. "It's the mindset," Corporal Mitchell explained to a group of prisoners one frozen morning. "Back home in Iowa, we get winters almost this cold. You learn to dress right, work steady, and not complain about things you can't change. Same with the mountains. They're there, they're big. You deal with it and move on." This pragmatism, this refusal to be impressed by challenges that the Japanese military culture would have treated as tests of spiritual fortitude, was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of American behavior. In January of 1945, the camp received news that the American forces had landed in the Philippines. For the prisoners, this meant an influx of new captives, men who had more recent experience of combat. Among the new arrivals was Captain Masao Kojima, a 38-year-old infantry officer who had fought in the Philippines. Kojima was bitter, angry, and openly hostile. "You have betrayed the emperor by surrendering," he told the existing prisoners during his first evening in camp. "You sit here in comfort while our brothers continue to fight. You have forgotten the way of the warrior." Commander Yamamoto listened to this tirade with patience. When Kojima finished, Yamamoto spoke quietly. "Captain, I understand your anger. I felt it too when I was first captured. But I have learned things here that you must also learn. Come with me tomorrow morning." The next morning, Yamamoto led Kojima to a vantage point within the camp's permitted area. From there, the full panorama of the Rocky Mountains was visible. "Count the peaks you can see," Yamamoto instructed. Kojima counted, his expression growing increasingly troubled. 50, 60, I lose count. "And this is one small section of one mountain range in one state of 48, Yamamoto said. "The Americans have shown us maps. These mountains run north for thousands of miles. They mine them. They farm their valleys. They build roads through them. They climb them for enjoyment. This is one part of one country that we thought we understood. He turned to face Kojima directly. We were not defeated by lack of courage or spiritual weakness, Captain. We were defeated by simple arithmetic. They can produce more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more everything than we can ever hope to match. And they can do it while maintaining prisoner camps like this one, while teaching us English, while treating us better than we treat our own soldiers. Kojima stared at the mountains for a long time. Finally, he said, "If this is true, then everything we were told was a lie." "Not a lie," Yamamoto corrected gently. "A carefully constructed truth that omitted the parts that would have made our mission seem impossible. Our leaders knew these mountains existed. They knew America's industrial capacity. They chose to believe that spirit could overcome material reality. They were wrong. Spring came late to Colorado in 1945, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape dramatically. The snowmelt turned streams into torrents, and the valleys erupted with wildflowers. The camp's gardens were planted with vegetables that would supplement the prisoners' diet. In April, news reached the camp that the conflict in Europe had ended. For the Japanese prisoners, this meant the full weight of American industrial might would now turn toward the Pacific. The implications were inescapable. But life in the camp continued with its strange mix of imprisonment and unexpected normalcy. The English classes continued, now attended by nearly 200 prisoners. Sports competitions became regular events. Some prisoners even began to integrate aspects of American culture into their daily routines. In June, a new program was introduced. Selected prisoners were allowed to take supervised trips to nearby towns for work details, helping with harvests, performing maintenance work. Commander Yamamoto was part of a group that traveled to a small farming community called La Junta. There, they helped a 70-year-old rancher named Thomas McAllister repair fences and irrigation systems. McAllister treated the Japanese prisoners with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he showed everyone, putting them to work without apparent concern. During a break, Yamamoto asked him through an interpreter, "Are you not angry that Japanese forces are fighting against your country?" McAllister considered this while rolling a cigarette. "Son, I got 2 boys in the service. One's in Europe, just made it through that whole mess. The other's on a ship somewhere in the Pacific, and I worry about him every day. So yeah, I'm angry about the conflict. But you fellows sitting here on my ranch, you're prisoners. You already lost your fight. Being angry at you won't bring my boy home any faster. Might as well get some work done instead." This practical wisdom captured something essential about the American approach. Americans seemed capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. You could be the enemy and also a useful worker, a dangerous opponent and also a human being deserving of basic dignity. In August of 1945, the camp was assembled for a special announcement. Captain Whitmore informed the prisoners that the conflict in the Pacific had ended. The Emperor himself had announced Japan's surrender. The reaction among the prisoners was complex. Relief mixed with shame, grief mixed with an odd sense of liberation. They had survived captivity with their honor relatively intact, or at least with a new understanding of what honor meant. Commander Yamamoto stood on the hill where he had brought Captain Kojima months before, looking at the mountains one last time as a prisoner. The peak stood unchanged, indifferent to human conflicts. "We never had a chance," he said quietly to Lieutenant Nakamura. "Not really. Not against a nation that could build all this and still have the resources to fight a conflict across an entire ocean." "No," Nakamura agreed. "But perhaps that was never the real question. Perhaps the question was whether we could learn from defeat what we refused to learn before it." The process of repatriation took months. Before they left, each prisoner was given the opportunity to write a final statement about their experience. Petty Officer Sato wrote, "I came to America as a prisoner expecting death or torment. Instead, I found mountains that humbled me and people who confused me by treating me as a human being rather than as the defeated enemy I knew myself to be. I returned to Japan with questions I never thought to ask." Sergeant Tanaka wrote, "The American doctor who saved my life did so not because I deserved saving, but because saving lives was his purpose. This simple statement contains more wisdom about the American character than all the intelligence briefings I received before combat." Lieutenant Nakamura wrote, I have seen mountains that should not exist in a nation I was taught to despise. I have learned that geography, like truth, cannot be ignored simply because it contradicts our preferred narrative. I returned to Japan humbled, but also strangely hopeful. Commander Yamamoto's statement was the longest. I have spent 18 months as a prisoner at Camp Grenada, and in that time, I have learned more about America than in all my years of military intelligence training. I learned that a nation's strength comes not just from steel production or military prowess, but from a fundamental assumption that problems have solutions, that geography is not destiny, that efficiency matters more than suffering, and that even enemies can be treated with basic human dignity. The mountains I have seen here are a physical manifestation of what we failed to understand. America's power comes from its scale, its diversity, its practical approach to challenges. We were defeated by arithmetic, geography, and industrial capacity, but we were also defeated by our own unwillingness to accept information that contradicted our assumptions. I returned to Japan uncertain about much, but certain of this. The next generation must learn to seek truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. In November of 1945, the last group of prisoners from Camp Grenada boarded trains for San Francisco. As the train pulled away, many crowded at the windows for a final look at the Rocky Mountains. The peaks stood as they had stood for millions of years, snow-covered summits gleaming in the morning sun, indifferent to human dramas, but serving nonetheless as silent witnesses to transformation. Men who had arrived as defeated warriors departed as students of a larger truth. That understanding your adversary is more valuable than underestimating them, that dignity extended to enemies does not diminish the victor, but enlarges them, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from confronting realities we would prefer to deny. The camp itself was decommissioned in 1946, but the memories carried away by those prisoners would persist for decades. In the years following the conflict, several of the former prisoners wrote memoirs about their experiences. Commander Yamamoto became a professor of international relations, teaching new generations about the importance of accurate intelligence and cultural understanding. Lieutenant Nakamura worked in rebuilding Japan's aviation industry. Petty Officer Sato became a translator and cultural liaison. In 1973, a group of former prisoners organized a return visit to Colorado. They traveled to the site where Camp Grenada had stood, finding only empty prairie and distant mountains. Commander Yamamoto, now 71 years old, stood once again looking at the Rocky Mountains. A reporter asked him what he felt. "Gratitude," Yamamoto said simply, "and humility. These mountains taught me that the universe is indifferent to human certainty. What we believe matters less than what actually is. I was fortunate to learn that lesson here, under circumstances that allowed me to survive and return home." The reporter pressed further. "Do you think the conflict could have been avoided if Japanese leadership had better understood America?" Yamamoto smiled. "I think that conflicts arise not from lack of information, but from the refusal to accept information that contradicts what we wish to believe. American industrial capacity was never a secret. These mountains were on every map. The truth was available. We chose not to see it, because seeing it would have made our chosen course seem impossible. The lesson is not simply to understand your adversary, but to be willing to understand them, even when that understanding is inconvenient." He turned back to the mountains one last time. "I spent 18 months as a prisoner within sight of these peaks. I have spent the subsequent 28 years as a free man trying to honor what they taught me. The mountains remain unchanged. They will stand here long after all of us who fought that terrible conflict are gone. They stand as a reminder that reality is larger than ideology, that truth is more important than comfortable certainty, and that sometimes the greatest service we can provide to future generations is simply to tell them what we saw, even when what we saw contradicts what we wanted to believe." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.